The wind tore across the frost-laden gardens of Hawthorne Manor, carrying with it the faint scent of evergreens and the sharp tang of snow. Evening had fallen like a velvet curtain over the countryside, yet within the grand ballroom, candles burned with a defiance against the encroaching chill. The Duke's estate, resplendent in gilded finery and polished wood, glimmered as though it existed outside time itself, a sanctuary for the privileged and the envious alike. Guests in lavish gowns and tailored coats whispered in murmurs, their voices soft as falling snow, yet sharp with judgment. Among them, one figure moved like a fragile bird caught in the storm, her gown of pale blue silk clinging damply to her frame, snowflakes melting against the fabric as if mourning her presence. Eleanor Whitmore had come, 5 years past, with nothing but her hopes and a quiet dignity that now felt like a relic of another life. The ball had promised delight once, but it delivered betrayal. Even from across the room, the memory pricked her heart with ice. The Duke's gaze, cold and unyielding, the cruel amusement of those who had once claimed acquaintance, and the final, shattering moment when she was cast into the snow. The memory was as vivid as the frost still clinging to the garden hedges. The sharp bite of winter, the laughter of the onlookers, the bite of humiliation that had cut deeper than any winter wind. Tonight, she returned not for vengeance, though whispers suggested that she might, but for herself, for the fragile embers of pride she refused to let die. The Duke, Ersa Blackwood, moved through the throng with the grace of a predator and the arrogance of a man accustomed to obedience. His dark coat brushed the floor, his posture immaculate, and yet there was a weight in his eyes, a shadow that even candlelight could not erase. Those who looked at him saw only the perfection of title, the command of presence, the promise of wealth and security. But Eleanor remembered the cruelty beneath, the sharpness of a man who could kneel over someone's fortune and step away with laughter on his lips. The room was a river of light and color. Crimson gowns flared like fire against polished marble. Gold embroidery caught flickers of candlelight in a dance of glinting warmth. The chatter was a current, soft and murmurous, carrying gossip as easily as petals ride the wind. Eleanor's own steps were measured, careful, as though each placement of her foot could restore some lost balance to the world. Her gloves were silk, her hair pinned with understated elegance, but it was her eyes, steady, unyielding, yet alive with an inner storm, that spoke of a history no finery could disguise. She did not look for the Duke. She could not yet bear the reckoning in his gaze. The crowd's attention shifted as he passed, a ripple of recognition, a sigh of approval, and a murmured curiosity. Eleanor felt the weight of every glance, as if it were a finger tracing the scars left upon her soul. A hush fell when the Duke halted before the center of the hall, eyes scanning faces with an imperious authority. Then, in the pause before someone spoke, he looked toward her, and, for a fraction of a heartbeat, time held its breath. The recognition flickered there, subtle and unformed, as if memory were weighing the truth of her presence against the distance of 5 long years. Eleanor met that glance only for a moment before she looked away, the faintest tremor of something unspoken curling through her chest. The whispers began then, threads of rumor curling through the ballroom like smoke. Is that? She has returned? After all these years? Faces turned, judgment dressed as curiosity, and Eleanor felt the sting she had learned to carry with stoic grace. Each whisper was a shard, yet she bore them with composure, lifting her chin, adjusting her fan, letting no one see the tremor of anger or the memory-laden ache beneath. 4 or 5 years she had carried the snow in her heart, and now it met the warmth of the room like ice against fire, threatening to melt into something both dangerous and beautiful. A careless slip of a glove, a locket dangling at her throat catching the chandelier's flame. These small details drew eyes, and with them came whispers louder than polite society allowed. The locket, a delicate gold heart once gifted in a moment of naive trust, now gleamed with an unspoken story. Some saw merely ornament, others as symbol. Eleanor felt the weight of its significance as acutely as the bite of winter once more, and yet she did not retract it. There was courage in vulnerability, she reminded herself, and she would not hide from the truth that clung to her like her own shadow. The Duke's attention lingered, not out of approval or amusement, but because recognition had arrived fully with the clarity of a thunderbolt. Her presence, her posture, the faint strength underlying her graceful exterior, all of it struck at him in ways he had not anticipated. A ripple of shame passed across his expression, unbidden, unmasking a crack in the armor of his pride. He turned slightly, glancing away, and yet the spell of her image remained in his mind, an imprint impossible to erase. Eleanor's heart, however, was not entirely still. Beneath the restraint, a cautious flame of anticipation stirred, not hope of reconciliation, not yet, but the thrill of being seen, finally, as more than rumor and shadow, was almost unbearable in its delicacy. Her child, safely ensconced with a trusted caretaker at a discreet distance, was absent from this scene, yet the memory of the little boy, 3 months old, tugged at her chest. He was the living proof of what had been taken from them both, and of what could never be denied. The Duke straightened, regaining composure, his jaw set with the authority of a man accustomed to control. Yet beneath the surface, a storm brewed. The whispers of the ballroom could not reach the depths of his realization, the truth that had crept in with her arrival, that she had endured, had prospered quietly, and that a child, a living testament, stood between them in ways neither could yet face. The evening progressed, the music swelling as violins and flutes wove a tapestry of sound around polished wood and whispered conversation. Eleanor moved with a careful grace, acknowledging old acquaintances with the faintest nod, yet keeping her distance from the Duke. And yet, across the crowded floor, their eyes met again, longer this time. Recognition no longer hesitant, but fraught with the weight of unspoken history, grief, and what might yet be reclaimed. Outside, the snow continued its quiet descent, blanketing the world in soft white, a mirror of the past that could not quite be undone. Within the hall, the warmth of candlelight seemed almost fragile, like a single thread holding back the chill of memory and loss. Eleanor felt it tug at her, a mixture of fear and anticipation, her fingers tightening around the fan in her hand, as though to steady her heart against the tremor that the Duke's presence always stirred. And then, as the Duke passed her once more, his hand brushing the tip of a chair, or perhaps nothing at all, there was a pause, a flicker, barely perceptible, yet undeniable. A moment where the world seemed to contract, where the echoes of the past and the stirrings of the future hung in suspended breath. Eleanor allowed herself a single, measured exhale, the memory of snow and humiliation still beneath her ribs, yet tempered by the undeniable pull of a reckoning that had only just begun. The ballroom, alive with gossip and glitter, faded to the periphery. All that remained was the weight of the glance, the tremor of recognition, and the whisper of what might come. Spring had arrived reluctantly at Hawthorne Manor, its timid sunlight spilling across frost-mottled lawns and awakening the gardens with a tentative warmth. Eleanor Whitmore moved among the emerging blooms, her gown of muted lavender brushing the soft earth, her presence calm but resolute. The faint scent of hyacinths and wet soil rose around her, mingling with the delicate aroma of her gloves, freshly washed and pressed. Though her steps were careful, measured, there was an undeniable fluidity in the way she navigated the world, a grace born of survival and quiet endurance. She carried herself with dignity, yet beneath the surface, a storm of memory and longing swirled, each heartbeat echoing the winter night that had once shattered her life. The fair that had drawn her this afternoon was alive with color and motion. Stalls brimmed with handcrafted silks, fruits glistening like jewels, and the chatter of families enjoying the first warmth of spring. Eleanor's eyes, however, were drawn not to the revelry, but to the faces in the crowd, the familiar and the curious, the cruel and the sympathetic. 5 years of absence had not erased her memory of those who had watched her humiliation with delight, nor had it dulled the ache of being cast aside. Her pulse quickened as she glimpsed the Duke moving among the gathering, a dark silhouette of command and refinement, his presence as formidable as ever. Ersa Blackwood had changed little in appearance, though the lines of his jaw were sharper now, and the steady weight of responsibility pressed upon his shoulders. His coat, richly cut and adorned with subtle embroidery, marked him unmistakably as a man of stature, yet there was a subtle hesitation in the way he scanned the crowd. He paused at intervals, fingers brushing against polished surfaces, eyes narrowing as if he sought something, or someone, beyond the throng of ordinary faces. The whispers that followed him were barely audible over the hum of activity, yet Eleanor caught fragments: astonishment, recognition, speculation. He had returned to the world she now inhabited, yet neither spoke openly of the years lost between them. Eleanor's gaze fell to the small bundle she carried discreetly beneath her cloak. 3 months old, and already a testament to courage and endurance, the child slept quietly, wrapped in soft linen embroidered with delicate lace. His presence was a secret tether to the past, a living proof of a love denied, of consequences neither society nor the Duke had foreseen. She adjusted the folds of her cloak, ensuring the boy remained hidden, yet the very act of holding him close brought warmth to her chest that winter's frost had never extinguished. The Duke's path curved near her stall, and for the briefest instant their eyes met. Recognition flickered, sharp and sudden, igniting a silent tempest. He paused, brow furrowing, lips pressing together in an expression of mingled surprise and unease. Eleanor allowed herself only a measured tilt of her chin, her face composed, her lips curving faintly. Not a smile, but a gesture of acknowledgement. The whispers in the crowd intensified, subtle gasps threading through the air as others noted the tension between them, unaware of the child whose very existence threatened propriety and scandal alike. A delicate gesture betrayed Eleanor's intent. She let the edge of her glove brush against a locket resting at her throat, the tiny emblem of gold catching the light of the afternoon sun. Those who saw it whispered anew, curious and speculative, while the Duke's eyes narrowed with recognition. The locket had been his gift once, a token of innocence and trust. Now, its presence in her hands was charged with history, memory, and unspoken accusation. He did not move toward her immediately, constrained by pride and the strictures of society, yet the weight of understanding settled heavily in his chest. Eleanor's steps carried her along the stalls, hands brushing past silks and glassware, her eyes flicking occasionally to the crowd. She noted the stares, the subtle bows of deference from some, the thinly veiled scorn from others, yet she pressed on with measured elegance. The child shifted slightly against her shoulder, stirring in the warmth of her embrace, and she felt a pulse of protective instinct that overshadowed even the pang of longing for the man who once had power over her heart. This quiet defiance, this calm assertion of self, was her shield against the tumult of social scrutiny and the Duke's complicated presence. Ersa Blackwood watched, torn between fascination, guilt, and the stirrings of a longing he did not yet name. His every instinct urged him to approach, to bridge the chasm of years and reclaim some measure of what had been lost, yet his pride and fear of impropriety restrained him. He lingered near the fountain, hands clasped behind his back, studying her from a distance that allowed decorum to mask the torrent beneath. The crowd, sensing the electric tension, whispered more eagerly, their curiosity a river carrying the two toward inevitable confrontation. The sun shifted behind a gathering cloud, casting a fleeting shadow over the fair and the pair within it. Eleanor adjusted her grip on the child, the warmth of his small body a grounding force against the tumult of recognition and memory. The locket gleamed once more as she moved, a silent message both to him and to herself. The past is not forgotten, nor is it conquered. Yet the present, fragile and uncertain, beckons with the possibility of reckoning. As the Duke's gaze lingered, a hand subconsciously brushing against the edge of a stall for support, a servant approached hurriedly with a whispered note. The message was brief but urgent. Something had occurred that demanded the Duke's immediate attention, drawing him reluctantly away from Eleanor's presence. His departure was measured, controlled, yet each step carried the weight of hesitation, of a mind already entangled in questions he had long avoided. Eleanor watched him retreat, her chest tight with a mixture of triumph, fear, and anticipation. She adjusted the cloak around her shoulders once more, ensuring her secret remained safe, yet the spark of recognition had been ignited. The crowd murmured around her, oblivious to the delicate balance of pride, longing, and the unspoken truths now set in motion. Beneath her composure, a storm of possibilities swirled, some fraught with scandal, some suffused with hope, but all inexorably tied to the man who had once cast her into snow and now could not ignore the life she bore as evidence of both courage and consequence. And as the fair carried on, vibrant and unsuspecting, Eleanor allowed herself a single, steadying breath, feeling the subtle thrill of change in the air, the first brush of a reckoning that would unfold with every measured step, every exchanged glance, until the truths they both carried could no longer be contained. Twilight draped itself across the manor gardens, gilding the hedges with a faint silver glow and painting the sky in muted shades of lilac and rose. The air smelled of damp earth and the first stirrings of spring blooms, a fragile perfume mingling with a crisp bite of lingering frost. Lanterns swung gently from wrought iron posts, casting trembling pools of light across gravel paths, their golden glow trembling in the gathering dusk. Eleanor Whitmore walked with careful deliberation, her cloak brushing the dew-laced grass, her eyes alert yet calm. Beneath the layers of silk and wool, her heart thrummed with a tension she had not known in years, a tension born of confrontation, of truths too long withheld, and of the fragile hope that even a man as proud as Ersa Blackwood could recognize what had been lost. The Duke emerged from the shadow of the terrace, his presence framed by the fading light, tall and imposing, yet not untouched by uncertainty. His coat, dark and immaculate, caught the lantern glow as he moved closer, the polished boots striking soft rhythms against the gravel. Recognition had fully settled now in his gaze, but it was complicated by guilt, longing, and disbelief. Eleanor had never doubted that he would remember her face, but the reality of her bearing, the quiet strength etched into her every movement, struck him more profoundly than memory alone could convey. For the first time in years, he found himself stripped of command, stripped of certainty, vulnerable in a way that unsettled every carefully constructed facet of his being. She stopped beneath the tallest lantern, the light illuminating the pale flush of her cheeks and the faint shadow of worry in her eyes. The child, swaddled carefully in her arms, stirred slightly, sensing the subtle tension that radiated from the pair. Eleanor adjusted the folds of the blanket, the fine linen brushing the infant's skin, grounding herself in the warmth of the small life she protected. His presence was at once a shield and a bridge, a living emblem of the past she bore quietly and the reckoning that had now arrived. "Eleanor," the Duke began, his voice low, restrained, as if each syllable required careful consideration. It carried the authority of his station, yet trembled with something softer, something unspoken. The name itself, uttered after 5 years, hung in the lantern-lit air like smoke, visible yet elusive. She did not respond immediately, her gaze steady on the path ahead, acknowledging him not with fear nor deference, but with the measured dignity that had been her armor since that fateful winter night. The tension between them was a living thing, palpable as the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Every breath, every subtle gesture was laden with meaning. Eleanor shifted slightly, allowing the light to glint off the locket at her throat, a delicate token of a time long past, gilded with memory and unspoken accusation. The Duke's eyes followed the movement, the recognition a dagger of both regret and desire. He knew, with a certainty that tightened his chest, that the child she carried was not merely a secret, but the undeniable proof of consequences he had ignored, a truth that demanded acknowledgement, reckoning, and perhaps, if courage could be summoned, a plea for forgiveness. I had no notion, he admitted at last, voice breaking under the weight of confession, the careful control he usually wielded slipping in the soft shadow of the garden. I could not have imagined, and yet, here you stand. The words faltered, incomplete, for no language could capture the tumult within him. The shame of neglect, the shock of revelation, the spark of something he could not name but felt in the tightening of his chest. Eleanor's eyes softened, not with weakness, but with a profound understanding that only those who had endured suffering could summon. "I have endured," she said quietly, her voice steady, measured, carrying both truth and restraint. "I have borne my life in silence. The child is my care, my responsibility. I ask nothing, nor do I offer you blame. You may have chosen absence, but I chose survival." Her words were neither accusatory nor pleading, yet each syllable struck the Duke with the force of a bell, resonant and unyielding. The air between them seemed to shimmer, heavy with emotion and the weight of unspoken years. For a long moment, they regarded one another, eyes locked, worlds of history and consequence converging in that brief, luminous stillness. The child stirred again, reaching tiny hands toward the Duke, and in that simple, instinctive gesture, the fragile bridge between past and present trembled into view. Ersa's fingers twitched, a reflexive movement of longing, hesitation, and emerging recognition, but he restrained himself, mindful of the delicate balance between propriety, pride, and the uncharted territory of atonement. A sudden rustle from the garden path broke the spell, an approaching servant, perhaps, or the murmur of distant voices, but the moment had already shifted. Something unspoken had passed between them. Acknowledgement of the child, recognition of enduring strength, and the silent promise that the past was no longer an insurmountable wall, but a threshold to be crossed, carefully, cautiously, together. Eleanor adjusted the infant against her shoulder, feeling the warmth radiate through her cloak, and allowed herself a single, faint exhale. She had not yet extended forgiveness, nor sought reconciliation, but the tension that had bound her heart in rigid frost for years had softened, just enough to hint that thawing was possible. The Duke remained, rooted in the glow of lantern light, his hand subconsciously brushing against the locket he once gave, his mind turning over possibilities and regrets with painstaking care. The garden held its breath with them, shadows lengthening, lanterns flickering, the child's small movements punctuating the delicate silence. Between them lingered the weight of years, the evidence of decisions made and ignored, and the fragile promise of what might yet be reclaimed. And as the Duke finally stepped closer, the faintest hesitancy in his stride, Eleanor met his gaze fully for the first time, the glimmer of recognition mirrored in both their eyes. A silent admission that the reckoning was no longer avoidable, and that the next steps would be both perilous and necessary. The grand hall of Hawthorne Manor glimmered in the soft radiance of 100 flickering candles, their light dancing across gilded moldings and polished parquet floors. Evening had settled with a hush, yet the hall thrummed with quiet anticipation. Guests in resplendent gowns and tailored coats moved in a careful choreography, aware of the social currents that flowed invisibly between them. Yet amid the opulence, Eleanor Whitmore stood apart, her gown of muted lavender understated against the shimmering richness of silk and satin around her. Her hands rested lightly upon the small bundle she carried. Her son, and her posture, both graceful and firm, broadcast a message of resilience that few could misread. She was a woman tempered by betrayal, refined by endurance, and she was no longer afraid to be seen. Ersa Blackwood entered the hall with all the authority of his title, yet his eyes betrayed the turbulence within. His gaze swept the room, noting familiar faces and unfamiliar admirers, yet it returned inexorably to her. Eleanor. Recognition had settled fully upon him, no longer hesitant, no longer veiled by the fog of years. She had returned not as the fragile figure of 5 winters past, but as a woman commanding quiet admiration and measured attention. The locket at her throat caught the chandelier's glow, a small but undeniable reminder of what had once been shared and what had been lost. Guests began to murmur, their whispers threading through the music and polite conversation, drawn by the subtle tension that now hung between them. Some recognized the past transgression, others sensed a story only half told, but all were aware of the charged silence that had begun to define the room. Eleanor's chest rose and fell with controlled steadiness, her fingers brushing her son's cheek, grounding herself in his warmth while allowing the eyes of the hall to linger without fear. She was no longer merely the object of gossip. She was a presence demanding acknowledgement, a woman whose dignity had survived winter's cruelest bite. The Duke moved toward her, deliberate, each footfall a measured declaration of intent. The hall seemed to contract around them, the glittering crowd fading into background murmur, leaving only the tension and anticipation that pulsed between them. He paused before her, bowing his head in a gesture both formal and vulnerable, a stark contrast to the imperious figure he presented in public. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low yet resonant, carrying the weight of years and the tremor of an emotion long suppressed. The single word hung in the air, a bridge between the past and the present, fraught with unspoken remorse and unacknowledged desire. She met his gaze with an unwavering steadiness, her lips a faint line of restraint. The child stirred against her, sensing the gravity of the moment, and Eleanor adjusted him slightly, lifting the infant to meet the Duke's view. Recognition sparked there as well, a flash of instinctive awareness, and the Duke's breath caught. The boy's small fingers curled around the edge of her gown, drawing her attention and a soft, almost imperceptible smile to her face. It was a tender affirmation of life, proof of endurance, and a symbol that no distance or time could undo. In that suspended heartbeat, the Duke lowered himself to one knee, the polished floor cool beneath his gloved hands. The gesture was both apology and acknowledgement, a display of humility that stunned the gathering. Guests froze mid-step, some audibly gasping, others whispering with growing excitement. The act carried a gravity that transcended ceremony. It was a declaration of accountability, a willingness to face consequences, and a step toward redemption. "Eleanor," he murmured again, this time with a softness that belied the authority of his rank. I was wrong. I cannot undo the winters past, yet I see you now. And him, he is ours." Her pulse quickened, a mixture of surprise, fear, and a tentative hope. Pride and caution warred within her, yet the clarity of the moment, the Duke's kneeling form, the boy's innocent eyes, the witness of the crowd, shifted the scales. She could retreat, she could deflect, she could shield herself as she had for half a decade, but the depth of honesty and vulnerability before her made hesitation almost impossible. Slowly, she extended a hand, not fully yet, but enough to bridge the space between dignity and reconciliation. The Duke's gloved fingers hovered, trembling slightly, mirroring the anticipation and trepidation that coursed between them. Whispers swelled in the hall, curiosity entwined with admiration, and the air seemed charged with both scandal and the possibility of restoration. The music, gentle and unobtrusive, carried the moment as if composing a score for the delicate tension unfolding. Eleanor inhaled, the scent of candle wax, polished wood, and spring blooms mingling with the warmth of her child and the unspoken promise stirring between them. Her heart beat in measured rhythm, aware of every eye upon them, yet anchored in the singular truth that this was her reckoning, and she would meet it fully. The Duke's eyes rose to meet hers, earnest, vulnerable, a silent plea wrapped in layers of pride and restraint. If you will allow it," he said, voice roughened with emotion, "I would ask only to be present, to protect, to honor you both, as I should have long ago." Eleanor studied him, weighing the sincerity, the patience and the courage inherent in that gesture. Her son's quiet stir against her shoulder reminded her that time and endurance had shaped the contours of her decision. And in that golden, candle-lit hall, amid the subtle tension and the collective breath of the watching crowd, Eleanor felt the first unspoken thaw of forgiveness. She did not yet surrender entirely. Her pride demanded its measure, but the possibility of reclamation, of acknowledgement, and of love long deferred shimmered between them. The Duke remained kneeling, hand poised yet waiting, eyes locked on hers, and the faint flicker of a future unbound by past cruelty hovered on the edge of realization. The first golden rays of dawn spilled across the gardens of Hawthorne Manor, painting the dewy grass in hues of amber and rose. A soft mist lingered among the budding flowers, curling around the marble fountain and the wrought iron gates like a delicate shroud of possibility. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the edge of the terrace, the morning chill brushing her cheeks, the warmth of her child pressed against her heart. The boy stirred gently, his tiny fingers clutching the folds of her gown, and she felt a fierce, protective tenderness surge through her. Today was no ordinary day. It bore the weight of reckoning, redemption, and a promise long denied. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the resolution that had lingered in shadow for 5 long years. Ersa Blackwood approached along the gravel path, each step deliberate, measured, yet lighter than it had been in months. His eyes, dark and intense, sought her with a vulnerability carefully masked behind the authority of his rank. The warmth of the morning sun caught the gold thread in his coat and the subtle sheen of his boots, but even the brilliance of finery could not overshadow the raw honesty in his expression. He paused before her, bowing his head in a gesture that blended humility with the lingering echo of aristocratic propriety. "Eleanor," he said, voice low and steady, "I come not as a man of station, but as one who has failed and yet hopes to amend." She met his gaze without hesitation. The morning's light revealed more than the beauty of the garden. It illuminated the unspoken truths etched into their faces, the years of separation, the moments of longing, the quiet endurance that had defined her survival. Eleanor's fingers tightened lightly around the blanket that held her son, feeling the subtle warmth of his breath against her wrist. The child's existence had been a secret, a fragile tether between past suffering and present possibility. Yet it was now the axis around which every word, every glance would pivot. The Duke knelt, an act deliberate, full of gravity. The polished marble beneath his knees did not chill him. It only grounded him in the seriousness of the moment. He extended his hands toward her and the child, an offering of penance and devotion in equal measure. "I cannot undo the winters I abandoned," he said, each syllable deliberate, heavy with remorse. "But I swear, by every principle I hold, to honor you both, to protect and cherish the life we share." The words hung between them, an intricate lattice of apology, acknowledgement, and unspoken hope, delicate enough to shatter if mishandled, yet powerful enough to shift the course of their lives. Eleanor studied him, tracing the faint tremor in his hand, the hesitation in his stance. She considered the years of pride, betrayal, and endurance, and yet she saw in him the man beneath the title, the man who had been blinded by arrogance, who now bore the vulnerability of recognition and love. Slowly, she extended her hand, the gesture small yet monumental, her fingers brushing against his. A tremor of electricity surged, unspoken and undeniable, linking the past's ache to the present's fragile promise. The child stirred again, reaching tiny hands toward the Duke, who lowered his gaze, awestruck, meeting the boy's innocence with reverence. The murmurs of the staff and distant onlookers remained at the edge of awareness, but in the golden light of dawn, only the 3 of them existed. Time seemed suspended. The world narrowed to the gravity of reunion, reconciliation, and the possibility of redemption. Eleanor's lips parted, and in her measured, unwavering voice she said, "The past has weighed heavily, but it no longer defines us. We may choose together how to move forward. Her words, restrained yet suffused with authority, carried a resonance that filled the garden and pierced the Duke's chest. He lifted her hand to his lips, a delicate, reverent kiss that spoke of contrition, devotion, and the courage it had taken to kneel before her. The child's fingers brushed the Duke's coat, as if giving silent consent, and a rare, genuine smile touched Eleanor's lips. The tension of years of separation, the ache of absence, the burden of societal expectation, all of it began to lift, leaving in its place the fragile bloom of trust, the warmth of tentative reconciliation, and the thrill of what might yet flourish. As they stood together, hands entwined, the morning sun gilded their figures, the mist curling about them like a blessing. Every sense seemed heightened. The chirping of birds, the subtle fragrance of newly opened blossoms, the warmth of the Duke's hand against her own, the soft weight of her child nestled safely between them. Eleanor realized that dignity, once threatened by cruelty, could coexist with vulnerability, and that love, once denied, could return with a gentle ferocity that left no part of the heart untouched. The Duke drew a slow, steady breath, eyes fixed on hers. "If you will allow me," he said softly, "I shall not waste another moment. Let us be as we ought, together, and let no shadow of the past claim what we may now embrace." Eleanor nodded, the faintest glimmer of tears catching the sunlight, not of sorrow, but of triumph and relief. And as the three of them, mother, child, and father, stood in the garden, framed by the gilded glow of dawn, the mist rising in silver tendrils, the world beyond the gates seemed to pause. In that moment, scandal, rumor, and judgment held no power. Only the quiet certainty of love reclaimed, lives intertwined, and a family whole at last. Yet in the deepest corner of the Duke's heart, beneath the joy and relief, a thought lingered. The past had not entirely surrendered, and the echoes of consequence would follow them still, subtle and insistent, reminding them that every triumph must be tenderly guarded against the unforgiving hand of fate.